At our divorce hearing, my wife stood in front of the entire courtroom, loud enough for everyone in the gallery to hear, and announced that she was finally going to live off my fortune. The crowd actually laughed along with her. I stayed completely calm, walked forward, handed the judge a single envelope, and quietly whispered just 5 words, "Check the date on her signature." Moments later, that same judge was laughing so hard he had to pause the proceedings, while my wife's face went completely white in front of everyone who'd just been laughing along with her. My name is Julian Marsh, and this is the story of the 12 years leading up to that moment, and the one piece of paper that changed absolutely everything. I want to give you the full picture before I get to that courtroom, because none of it makes sense without understanding who I was before I ever had any real money to speak of. I met my wife, Camille, when I was 25 years old, working 2 jobs, barely scraping together rent for a small apartment while trying to build a small software consulting business on the side, nights and weekends, whatever time I could carve out after my day job ended. Camille came from a comfortable family, her father a respected orthopedic surgeon, and honestly, in those early years, I always felt a quiet, nagging awareness that I was the less impressive partner in that relationship, financially speaking at least. We got married when I was 27, still years before my consulting business turned into anything meaningful. I remember our wedding being modest, practical, the kind of wedding 2 people plan when neither of them has real money yet, though Camille's family, subtly but consistently, made sure everyone knew they'd contributed significantly more to the budget than my side of the family had. I didn't mind at the time. I loved her, genuinely, and I believed, the way you do early in a relationship, that we were building something together as true equals, regardless of whose family had more money in the bank. About 3 years into our marriage, my consulting business finally started gaining real traction, landing a handful of contracts with mid-sized companies that needed help modernizing outdated internal software systems. It was slow, steady growth for the first few years, nothing dramatic, but enough that we were able to move into a nicer apartment, then eventually a modest house, the kind of gradual financial improvement that felt earned rather than lucky. The real turning point came around year 7 of our marriage, when one of my early clients, a regional logistics company, asked me to help them build a custom scheduling and routing platform from scratch, something none of the existing software on the market handled well for their specific needs. That project turned into something much bigger than either of us expected, and within 2 years, that same platform had been licensed out to over a dozen other logistics companies across the region, transforming my small one-man consulting business into a legitimate software company with real, recurring revenue. By our 10th wedding anniversary, that company was worth several $1,000,000, and honestly, that's around the time I first started noticing subtle shifts in how Camille talked about our relationship, about money, about what she felt she was owed after putting up with the lean years, as she started calling them, years that, frankly, hadn't felt lean to either of us at the time, just normal, honest years of building something from nothing together. I want to be careful here, because I don't want to paint an unfair picture. For most of those 12 years, I genuinely believed Camille and I were partners in every real sense, even during the years when I was the one working nights and weekends to build something out of almost nothing. But looking back now, I think some part of her had always quietly measured our marriage against her own family's financial comfort, and once my business started generating real wealth, that quiet measurement slowly turned into something closer to entitlement. The specific moment I started seriously questioning the state of our marriage came about a year before the divorce hearing, when I discovered, almost by accident, that Camille had been meeting regularly with a divorce attorney for nearly 4 months without ever mentioning it to me. I found out through an old friend, someone who worked in a completely unrelated field but happened to run into Camille at that attorney's office building, mentioned it casually in conversation, having no idea it would mean anything significant to me at all. I confronted Camille about it gently, genuinely hoping there was some innocent explanation. There wasn't. She admitted, almost casually, that she'd been quietly exploring what a divorce settlement might look like, just to understand her options, she said, given how much the company had grown over the previous few years. I remember sitting there, genuinely stunned, not so much by the idea of divorce itself, because honestly, I think some part of me had sensed our marriage drifting apart for a while by that point, but by the fact that she'd been quietly preparing an exit strategy focused specifically around my company's finances, months before ever having an honest conversation with me about the actual state of our relationship. If you've ever discovered that someone you trusted completely had been quietly preparing for your relationship's ending without ever actually telling you it was ending, I think you understand exactly the kind of cold, strange clarity that moment gave me. And if this story is already pulling you in, go ahead and subscribe now, because what I did over the following months, quietly, carefully, before that divorce hearing ever happened, is honestly the part of this story people message me about the most. I didn't confront her with anger in that moment. Instead, I did something I probably should have done years earlier, given how much the business had grown. I quietly consulted with a family law attorney of my own, a careful, thorough woman named Patricia Kwan, and asked her to review every piece of paperwork tied to our marriage and the company's ownership structure from the very beginning. Here's where the story takes a turn I genuinely hadn't expected when I first sat down with Patricia. Years earlier, back when my consulting business first started gaining real traction, around year 3 of our marriage, Camille's own father, the orthopedic surgeon, had actually insisted, somewhat forcefully at the time, that we sign a postnuptial agreement, a formal document clarifying that any future business growth stemming specifically from my consulting work would remain classified as my separate property, protected from full 50-50 division in the event of a divorce. I remember at the time being a little surprised her father would push for something like that, protecting me rather than her, but he'd explained it as simply sound financial planning, the kind of practical advice you'd expect from someone with his professional background. Camille had signed that postnuptial agreement willingly at the time, years before the company was worth anything significant, back when protecting a business that barely existed yet probably felt like an abstract, meaningless formality to her. What Camille apparently either forgot entirely or assumed I'd forgotten as well, was that the document existed at all, buried in old paperwork from nearly a decade earlier, completely irrelevant to her day-to-day life until suddenly, years later, it became the single most important document in our entire divorce proceeding. Patricia confirmed, after reviewing everything carefully, that the postnuptial agreement was airtight, properly witnessed, properly dated, fully enforceable under state law. Which meant that despite the company now being worth several $1 million, the overwhelming majority of that value legally remained my separate property, entirely outside the scope of standard marital asset division, regardless of whatever confident announcements Camille had been making to her friends and family about finally getting to live off my fortune. I didn't tell Camille any of this before the hearing. I want to be honest about why. Part of it was strategic, obviously, but honestly, a larger part of it was that I wanted to see, clearly and without any doubt, exactly what she genuinely believed she was entitled to, unfiltered by any knowledge of what the actual legal reality would be. What I witnessed over those following months, watching her confidently plan an entire post-divorce lifestyle around money that, legally, had never actually been available to split in the first place, told me more about who she'd become than any single conversation could have. The day of the hearing arrived, and the courtroom was, notably, more crowded than I expected for what should have been a fairly standard proceeding. Several of Camille's friends and family members had come to watch, apparently expecting something close to a celebration on her behalf. I remember Camille looking almost giddy walking in, confident, practically glowing with anticipation. When given the opportunity to make her opening statement regarding asset expectations, Camille stood up, and rather than simply stating her position professionally the way these hearings usually go, she turned slightly toward the gallery, toward her assembled friends and family, and announced, loud enough for the entire room to hear clearly, that she was finally going to get to live the life she deserved. Finally live off my fortune after everything she'd put up with over the years. Several people in the gallery actually laughed along with her, this strange, celebratory energy filling the room like they were all attending some kind of victory party rather than a legal proceeding. I stayed completely calm through all of it. When it came time for my side to respond, I simply stood, walked forward, and handed the judge a single sealed envelope containing a certified copy of that postnuptial agreement, along with Patricia's formal legal brief outlining its enforceability. I leaned in slightly and quietly said just 5 words, loud enough only for the judge to hear clearly, "Check the date on her signature." I want to describe what happened next as carefully as I can, because it's honestly one of the strangest, most satisfying moments I've ever witnessed in my life. The judge, a serious, no-nonsense man who'd clearly presided over hundreds of these proceedings before, opened the envelope, began reading, and within about 30 seconds, his expression shifted from routine professional attention into something close to genuine, barely contained amusement. He actually started laughing, not maliciously, but with this kind of stunned disbelief, looking up at Camille, then back down at the document, then back up at her again. He explained to the room, still visibly amused, that the postnuptial agreement in front of him, signed willingly and properly witnessed nearly 9 years earlier, clearly and specifically classified the business assets in question as separate property, meaning the overwhelming majority of what Camille had just confidently announced to a room full of her own friends and family that she'd soon be living off of, legally, was simply never available to her in the first place. I watched Camille's face change in real time, that confident, glowing energy from moments earlier completely draining away, replaced by this pale, stunned expression as she slowly began to understand exactly what had just happened in front of everyone who'd been laughing along with her celebratory announcement only minutes before. The same gallery that had been laughing supportively alongside her now sat in an uncomfortable, awkward silence, several people visibly avoiding eye contact with her entirely. If you've made it this far, thank you for sticking with me, and if you haven't subscribed yet, this is a great moment to do it, because what happened over the following months, both to Camille and to our actual final settlement, honestly surprised even me. The final settlement, once everything was properly sorted through, gave Camille a fair, reasonable division of the assets we genuinely built together during the years before my company existed, our house, our joint savings, a fair split of our shared retirement accounts. But the company itself, the millions of dollars in value it had grown into, remained legally protected exactly as that postnuptial agreement, signed nearly a decade earlier back when neither of us imagined it would ever actually matter, had always specified. Camille tried, briefly, through her own attorney, to challenge the agreement's validity, arguing she hadn't fully understood what she was signing at the time. But the documentation was simply too thorough, too properly witnessed, drafted specifically at her own father's insistence years earlier, which made that particular argument almost impossible to sustain credibly in front of the same judge who'd already reviewed it directly. I think about that courtroom sometimes, the sound of that judge's genuine, stunned laughter, the sudden silence that followed from a gallery that had been cheering Camille on just moments earlier. I don't think about it with much bitterness anymore, honestly, mostly I think about it as a strange, almost surreal example of how quickly a room full of supportive laughter can turn into uncomfortable silence, once the actual facts of a situation finally become clear to everyone standing in it. Camille and I haven't spoken much since the settlement finalized, which honestly feels appropriate given everything that happened. I've heard, through mutual acquaintances, that she's had to significantly adjust her expectations about the lifestyle she assumed was coming her way, which I won't pretend doesn't carry a certain quiet satisfaction, even now. If there's one thing I hope you take from my story, it's this. Protecting what you've genuinely built, quietly and properly, long before you ever think you'll need that protection, can end up being the single most important decision you make in your entire life, even if it takes nearly a decade before you ever fully understand exactly why. If this story meant something to you, please subscribe to the channel, because there are more stories exactly like this one coming every week, honest, real, and sometimes surprising in ways you don't expect. Thank you for listening to mine.